Chapter 1. Elaine Wilby seldom cooked elaborate meals. After 8 hours behind a desk, she felt no inclination for further toiling the kitchen, especially since she herself wasn't all that interested in food. It seemed ridiculous to invest 2 or 3 hours in some fancy concoction which tasted no better than a nice meatloaf, and which was chewed, swallowed, and digested by precisely the same processes. Ronald was not particularly fussy either, so long as he was allowed seconds and a nice dessert. Her former husband had been rather vulgar about food. He enjoyed dishes like pig's feet with sauerkraut, and smelly cheeses, not to mention whiskey and beer, and cigars which permeated the house with the odor of dirty feet. A wonder the marriage had lasted as long as it did. Mrs. Wilby had been concerned principally for Ronald. A growing boy needed the guidance of his father, or so she had then believed. Now she knew better. Ronald was doing very well with no interference whatever from his father, and this was precisely the way Mrs. Wilby wanted it. Tonight she had prepared a particularly nice Sunday dinner, a small rolled roast with peas and mashed potatoes, and for dessert the frozen banana cream pie which Ronald liked so much. As Mrs. Wilby carved the roast, she reflected that this was a job Ronald should take over. Carving was a skill which every gentleman should master. Of course Ronald was only 16, going on 17, and why push maturity upon the boy? He was growing up fast enough already, far too fast, in fact, for Mrs. Wilby's taste. She watched him as he ate. Ronald had turned out well. His grades at school were better than average, and could be much improved if he'd only buckled down to his studies. A nice-looking boy, she thought, not handsome in the ordinary sense, but dignified and sensitive-looking. Heck'd afford to lose 15 or 20 pounds, but this was no cause for concern. Ronald had matured tardily. Sooner or later he would convert all that baby fat to solid muscle. Ronald's hair was dark like his father's, and he had inherited his father's frame, heavy hips, shoulders perhaps a trifle too narrow, long legs and arms. The broad brow, the long straight nose, the full lips came straight from Elaine's side of the family, the Daskins, as did Ronald's courtesy, thoughtfulness and candor. Ronald shared her detestation of whiskey and cigars and had promised never to drink or smoke. The thought excited a chain of recollections, and she smiled grimly. Her subconscious must have been at work when she planned so festive a meal. She asked, "Do you know what day today is?" "Of course. It's Sunday." "What else?" Ronald pursed his lips as he had seen his mother do. "It's not my birthday." "That's next Saturday." "March 20th is your birthday." "I don't think it's a holiday. I give up." "You wouldn't remember. 10 years ago today your father and I decided to go our separate ways. 10 whole years. Do you miss him?" "Not in the least." "I don't either. But I wonder why he never comes to see us." 10 years ago L/1RS. Wilby had offered to waive child support on condition that Armand Wilby give a part-time custody and visiting privileges, a proposition to which Armand, with his slick salesman's facility and eye for the main chance, had quickly agreed. And why trouble Ronald now with the sordid details? "He's probably just not interested," said Mrs. Wilby. Ronald gave his head a shake of deprecation. "Well, I'm glad he lets us live in this house, even if it is an old monstrosity." "The house is Victorian," said Mrs. Wilby evenly. "It's not a monstrosity, as you put it. That's what the kids at school call it. They don't know any better." "I'll agree to that. They're a pretty common bunch." "It's still nice of him, though." Mrs. Wilby sniffed. Perhaps, after all, certain realities should be made clear to Ronald. The situation isn't all that simple. "Oh? Why not?" "When a husband and wife are divorced," explained Times FRS Wilby, "the wife is entitled to a monthly payment called alimony, for all the trouble she's been subjected to. Instead of alimony, we are given the free use of this house." Ronald gave an urbane nod. All was now clear. Remarkable, none the less, how anyone, Armand Wilby, the President of the United States, Jesus Christ himself would dare cause his mother trouble of such magnitude. Elaine Wilby, a solid well-fleshed woman //, a bun au fache blonde hair, a pale complexion and cool blue eyes, was not a woman to be trifled with. At Central Valor Hardware, where she worked an accounting machine, her decisiveness had generated a whole cycle of office legends, and even Mr. Lang accorded her an uneasy deference. Mrs. Wilby's great hope for Ronald was a medical career. Often she envisioned him proud and tall in a white coat performing miraculous cures. Ronald Wilby, M.D. But whenever she mused along these lines, a second thought clutched at her heart. In 2 short years Ronald would be going off to college, followed by medical school and internship. Every bit of fluff in sight would have her hooks out for him. No doubt he'd marry and start a life of his own, and what then for her? Going to work early and coming home late to a lonely old house, with only the television for company. Ronald was aware of his mother's preoccupation. Sometimes when she refused him an extra helping of ice cream, he would say, "I'm lucky to have you worrying about me. I don't know how I'll manage when I'm off on my own." Whereupon Mrs. Wilby would say, "Well, I suppose it won't matter this once. But we've really got to put you on a firm diet." Heavens, Mother! I'm not fat. Just big. You could easily lose 20 pounds, dear. It's not a healthy condition. Ronald's bulk also attracted the attention of the football coach, who wanted Ronald to try out for the team. Ronald said he'd think about it. He had no taste for hard knocks, and his mother would not care for the idea, he was certain. In matters regarding his health she took no chances. A sneeze meant hot water bottles and layers of warm clothing. Every scratch was bathed in alcohol, anointed /Vith salve and dressed in an impressive bandage. Sports were vulgar, pointless, and dangerous. How could people waste money at a football game when there was so much misery and devastation in the world crying out for attention? Ronald had come to share this point of view. Still, he could see that athletes enjoyed some very real advantages. There was a certain Laurel Hansen, for instance, who doted both on football and football players, but who evaded all Ronald's advances. Would she go to the movies? Sorry, she'd been asked to a slumber party. Would she like to drop by the House of Music to help pick out some records? Sorry, she had to ash her hair. What about Henry's joint after school for a Sunday? Sorry, she had a tennis date. The situation gnawed at Ronald's self-esteem, even though he could readily perceive the intellectual limitations of such prognathous young louts as Jim Neal and Irvin Loder, both on good terms with Laurel Hansen. Ronald himself, of course, was a natural aristocrat, a gallant figure after the Byronic tradition, driven by a wild and tempestuous imagination. He had written several poems, among them Ode to Dawn, The Gardens of My Mind, The World's an Illusion, all of which his mother considered excellent. When he looked in the mirror and held his head just right, the heaviness at his cheeks and jaw fell away, and there, gazing back through heavy-lidded eyes, stood a dashing cavalier with a long noble nose and a dreamer's forehead, whom no girl could conceivably resist. If only he could induce Laurel off somewhere alone and enchant her /rith the splendor office visions. For Ronald, a devotee of fantasy fiction, had contrived a wonderful land which lay behind the mountain of the Seven Gowls and across the aquiline sea, Atlanta. Ronald had spoken of Atlanta and its inhabitants to his mother, but she seemed rather skeptical. On second thought, perhaps it was best not to confide in Laurel, not for a while anyway. He didn't want her thinking him a weirdo. Chapter 2. On Ronald's birthday, Mrs. Wilby Times Vase prepared a special dinner of Ronald's favorite dishes. This year the process would be less hectic than usual, since Ronald's 17th birthday fell on Saturday. For months Ronald had dreamed of impossible gifts: a motorcycle, Asmol-colored TV for his room, a 3-day tour to Disneyland, a high-power telescope, a sailing kayak, and also, this with a lewd private snicker, Laurel Hansen Sunderpants. He had dropped hints in regard to the motorcycle, to which his mother gave short shrift. Motorcycles were simply invitations to injury, and the people who rode them were a seedy group indeed. And what was wrong with Ronald's fine 3-speed bicycle off which he had been so proud only a few years before? Nothing's wrong with the bike, Ronald growled. It's just that I'm old enough to drive. In fact, I've been old enough for a whole year. I don't suppose you'd let me cheat a car. You suppose correctly. One car in the family is enough. Can you imagine what the insurance would cost? Probably a lot. Mrs. Wilby nodded curtly. Still, it's time you learned to drive, just in case of emergencies. But put the extravagant notions about cars and motorcycles out of your head. A car would interfere with your grades, which aren't all that good for a person who intends to go on to university and medical school. Ronald gave a disconsolate shrug. Just as you say. Saturday morning arrived, and Ronald found himself moderately pleased // his gifts. There was the stylish new safari jacket he had coveted, several books, Lives Oft Great Composers, How to Construct Your Own Telescope, Is There Life on Other Worlds? By Pal Anderson, and the Tolkien Lord of the Rings trilogy. A greeting card from Aunt Margaret in Pennsylvania was given substance by the attached $5 bill. There was also a wallet of simulated alligator skin, with a certificate entitling Ronald Arden Wilby to 10 lessons at the Delta Driving School. Ronald reflected that things might have gone far worse. The jacket fit perfectly. Inspecting himself in the mirror, Ronald thought that he cut quite a fine figure, and his mother agreed. The color is very good on you, and the jacket is cut well. You really look quite trim. Breakfast went according to Ronald's dictates: pineapple juice, Danish pastry with hot chocolate, followed by pork sausages and strawberry waffles with whipped cream. As Ronald ate, he looked through his books. The lives of the great composers he recognized as an attempt to interest him in good music, as distinguished from the sit-in and rumpus to which Ronald usually listened. For a fact, the book looked interesting, and he saw some rather rare episodes in the early life of Mozart which his mother certainly had not noticed. He took up How to Construct Your Own Telescope. Said Ronald, this is interesting. I didn't know that. They say grinding a mirror entails a great deal of painstaking work. Nothing really worthwhile comes easy, said Mrs. Wilby. I'd just as soon work with a set of lenses, said Ronald. They come in kits from Edmund Scientific, and there wouldn't be all that rubbing and polishing. Mrs. Wilby made no further comment. Astronomy, whether by lens or by mirror, would make a wonderful hobby for Ronald, who spent far too much time daydreaming over heaven no /ns what. She cleared the table while Ronald considered the advantages of a telescope. His bedroom window commanded a view of the Murray house, about 100 yards distant. One of the second-story windows opened into the bedroom of the Murray twins, Della and Sharon, and it might be interesting to see what transpired there of evenings. Aerially powerful telescope might resolve significant details even at the distance of Laurel Hansen's house, 6 blocks away. Unfortunately, a stand of eucalyptus trees obscured the view. Might it be possible to climb a eucalyptus tree carrying a telescope? Something to think about, at any rate. At 3 o'clock Mrs. Wilby served a birthday dinner of chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, and a big banana cream cake from the bakery. Ronald extinguished the candles with a single blast and elected to accompany his cake with a helping of vanilla ice cream. After dinner, Ronald wondered what Laurel might be up to and sauntered to the telephone. He started to dial, then hesitated. If he simply paid Laurel a visit, sure wouldn't he have a chance to say no? He'd be able to talk /Rither, and perhaps she'd recognize the glamour and scopy of his personality, and who knows what might come of the episode. He went to his room, combed his hair, sprayed himself with Tahitian Prince cologne. He donned his nude safari jacket, glanced in the mirror, and gave the image a jaunty salute. He went downstairs. I'm going out for a walk, he told his mother. I'll be back after a bit. Ronald marched along at a good pace, sternly erect, the better to set off his jacket. From Orchard Street he turned into Honeysuckle Lane, which skirted the rear of the old Hastings estate, walked down to Drury Way, turned right and walked another 2 blocks to Laurel Hansen's home. Ralph Hansen, Laurel's father, operated the Sierra Lumber Company. The Hansens, by Oakmead standards, lived luxuriously in a large ranch-style house with affordability of used brick. White shutters flanked the windows, the shake roof was stained green. Mrs. Hansen was prominent in Oakmead society and also an assiduous gardener. Rose bushes lined the walk, chrysanthemums, asters, daisies, and petunias bloomed around the edges of an immaculate lawn. Ronald sauntered up the path, annoyed to find his heart beating faster than usual. There was no reason for nervousness, so he assured himself, none whatever. At the front door he settled his jacket, rang the bell, and waited. Perhaps Laurel was home alone. She'd look forth wistful and lonely, and there would be Ronald. So many wonderful things might happen. Laurel's mother opened the door, a slim, handsome woman of 40 with a modish thatch of shining silver hair, sea blue eyes like Laurel's, features delicate and brittle as porcelain. She had never met Ronald and looked him blankly up and down. Yes? Ronald cleared his throat and spoke in his best voice. Is Laurel home? Mrs. Hansen failed to notice Ronald's suave courtesy. She's out in back. I wonder if I might see her. Mrs. Hansen made an indifferent gesture. Go right on through. You'll find her out at the pool. Ronald marched stiffly into the house, where he paused, intending to chat a moment or two, but Mrs. Hansen had already gone off down the hall. A chilly woman, and rather proud of herself, thought Ronald. He looked around the room, Laurel's native habitat. The intimacy was thrilling. She breathed this air, she sat in these chairs, she looked at these pictures, she warmed herself at this fireplace. Ronald took a deep breath and expanded his soul, trying to absorb the environment. He felt he knew Laurel better already. He heard light steps. Mrs. Hansen came back into the room with eyebrows slightly raised. She spoke in a bright, clear voice. Laurel's out in back. Oh yes, said Ronald hastily. I was just admiring the room. Mrs. Hansen seemed not to hear. This way. She led Ronald across the living room, through a pair of sliding doors, and out upon the patio. Laurel, called Mrs. Hansen. Someone to see vous. Laurel, splashing in the swimming pool with her friends, paid no heed. Mrs. Hansen said to Ronald, I imagine you can get her attention one way or another. Thank you very much, said Ronald. He advanced upon the pool. The situation was not at all to his liking. He felt hurt and angry with Laurel. She should have been home alone, moping and mournful, waiting for him to call instead. Look at her, callously enjoying herself with her friends. There were 2 girls, Wanda McPherson and Nancy Rucker, and 2 boys, Jim Neal, fullback on the football team, and Martin Woolley. Jim Neal's father owned Oakmead Liquors, which should have blasted Jim's social status, yet here he swam in the Hansen pool with complete aplomb. Not only that, Laurel was climbing up his back and diving from his shoulders, to Ronald's disgust and disapproval. Martin Woolley, the senior class president, lacked Jim Neal's physique. In fact, he seemed all arms, legs and ribs. His hair was a nondescript tangle, his nose hung like an icicle, his mouth drooped in a saturnine leer. Martin's popularity was a complete puzzle to Ronald, but there he sprawled beside the swimming pool with Wanda and Nancy hanging on his every word. Ronald went to stand beside the pool. Hello everybody. Wanda, Nancy and Martin acknowledged his presence politely enough. Laurel gave her hand a casual flip. Jim wallow / ring down in the water, ignored him. Ronald watched as he swam underwater, seized Laurel's ankles, put his head between her legs, raised up and tossed her screaming backwards into the water. Laurel wore a white bikini, Ronald watched in fascination as she paddled towed ladder and climbed out to stand dripping. Laurel was a blonde elf, slender, FLA // exquisite, enticing as a bowl of strawberries and ice cream. Never had Ronald seen anything so urgently beautiful. But how could her mother allow it? The bikini concealed nothing. She might as well have been nude. Ronald sauntered around the pool. Laurel glanced at him sidewise and spoke in a voice almost without inflection. "Well, Ronald, how are you today?" "Oh, fine. I was just // andering around and I thought I'd drop by and see what you were doing." "I've been swimming." "I see." Ronald hesitated, then asked, "Are you busy tonight? I mean, would you like to go to a show?" Laurel shook her head. "I'm doing something else." Ronald thrust his hands in his pockets and frowned out over the pool. "Well, what about tomorrow night? We're having company." "Oh. Well, maybe some other time." Laurel said nothing. Jim Neal came floating past on his back. Laurel stepped forward, put her foot on his chest and pushed him under. "That's for ducking me." "Nowry even." Jim splashed up some water, and Ronald jumped back in indignation. "Hey! I'm up here too." "It's just water," said Jim. "It'll evaporate in an hour or so." "Some people even drink it," said Martin. Ronald forced an easy smile. "I don't object to water, but I'd just as soon it evaporated someplace else." Laurel went to the diving board, poised herself, and dived. Ronald went to a deck chair and sat down, an elegant sophisticate amused by the happy play of children. He couldn't take his eyes off Laurel. The little patches of white cloth were more explicit than nothing whatever. Ronald sat half an hour, no one paying him any attention. Mrs. Hansen came out to the pool. Mrs. Rucker just called. "They're starting up the charcoal. You'd better step lively if you want any steak." The group went chattering off to the dressing rooms. Ronald remained in the deck chair. He sat a half minute. Then he rose to his feet and walked around the house, through a gate, and out upon the street. Head lowered, shoulders hunched, he strode back up Drury Way. Mter a block he halted to gaze back toward the Hansen house. If emotion could be projected in a beam, if hate could be made hot, the house would roil up in a burst of flame, and all within would come dancing out, to roll and tumble across the lawn. Let them all die, the worthless, futile creatures. He'd save none of them except Laurel. He'd take her to a far island, or snowbound cabin, with nobody there but the two of them. How she'd regret her conduct. How she'd plead for forgiveness. He'd say, "Remember at your swimming party, how you went away and left me alone by the pool. I'dn't he forget things like that?" Unfortunately, such a requital was difficult to arrange. Breathing hard through his nose, Ronald continued up Drury Way, with sunset light shining through the poplar trees of the Hastings estate. At Honeysuckle Lane he glanced back once more and saw the group come forth and climb into Jim Neal's old Volkswagen. Ronald grimaced. He should have flattened the tires or pulled a wire out of the distributor. Except that Jim Neal would guess the culprit's identity, and that wouldn't be good. The barbecue Jim would no doubt take Laurel off in his car. Jim was bold, Laurel was feckless. Ronald knew what was going to happen. He felt curiously sick, his throat throbbed with woe and rage and mortification. No help for it, but sometime, somehow, he would get his own back. He turned up Honeysuckle Lane, and the setting sun at his back projected a gigantic shadow ahead, which for 50 yards or so provided Ronald a gloomy diversion. How grotesquely the shadow reacted to his movements. Toward him came Carol Matthews, riding her bicycle. Carol, 11 years old, as blonde as Laurel Hansen, lived around the corner on May Street. The sun shone into her face, illuminating her beautiful green eyes. She failed to see Ronald and rode directly into him. Ronald caught the handlebars and backing away brought the bicycle to a halt. The bicycle fell over. Ronald caught Carol before she fell to the ground and held her against his chest. "What do you think you're doing?" Ronald snarled. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I didn't see you." Carol was already adolescent. Ronald could feel her breasts against his chest. He began to seethe with a complicated emotion. None of these blonde girls cared what they were doing. They thought they could get away with anything. He bent his head and kissed Carol's mouth. She stared up in amazement, then tried to squirm loose. "Let me go." "Just a minute," said Ronald. "You've got something coming." "No, I don't." "Let me go." "Not so fast." Ronald's hand, seemingly of its own volition, groped under her skirt. Carol yelled in outrage. Ronald clapped his hand over her mouth. He glanced up and down the lane. "Empty." He growled into Carol's ear. "Are you going to yell?" "Are you?" "You'd better not." Carol looked up with glazed green eyes and shook her head. Ronald took away his hand, and she gasped for breath. "Please don't. Please let me go." "I didn't do it on purpose. Times I'm not thinking about that now." Clamping her mouth once more, Ronald dragged her, kicking and hopping, squirming and jerking, into the grounds at the back of the old Hastings estate. Pulling her face free, Carol gasped, "I didn't want to go in here." She started to scream. Ronald thrust his hand over the wetness of her open mouth. She bit his palm, and received a slap in stern retribution. Carol made frantic noises through his hand. She seemed to be saying, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." Ronald eased his grip. "Don't you dare yell. Do you hear? Say yes." Carol obstinately said nothing and tried to pull away. Ronald cuffed her and dragged her back. He inspected the overgrown old garden. Carol whimpered, "What are you going to do?" "You'll see." "No." Carol raised her voice once more. Ronald instantly closed off her mouth and thrust his face down to within 6 inches of hers. He spoke in measured, ominous tones. "You'd better not bite me again, and you'd better not yell." Carol stared up like a hypnotized rabbit. Ronald withdrew his hand and Carol squeezed her eyes shut, as if by this means to obliterate the entire situation. Ronald thrust her to the ground under an old weeping willow tree. "Relax," said Ronald. "This is going to be fun." "Really, itis?" Carol's mouth sagged and warped. Tears began to stream down her cheeks. "Please don't." "No. No, no, no. Be quiet. And afterwards you'd better not tell." Carol lay sobbing. Leaves and grass had caught in her hair. She looked disheveled and distraught. This, thought Ronald, was what Laurel would look like under similar circumstances. That //7 would have made it even better. Ronald N0 //7 decided to be nice. He stroked her hair. "There now. That was fun, wasn't it?" "No." "Of course it was." "Let's do it again tomorrow." "No." "Why not?" "I'll." Ronald raised his head and listened through the dusk. Someone was calling. "Carol! Carol!" A woman's voice. "That's my mother. I'm going home right now." Carol started to sit up. Ronald pushed her back. "Do //RN. Just a minute. Are you going to tell?" Carol compressed her lips and shook her head, a shake off resentment and obstinacy rather than a commitment to silence. "Oh, come on." Ronald spoke in a bluff, cajoling voice. "Wouldn't you like to do it again, maybe tomorrow?" "No." "And you won't either, because you'll be in jail." She pulled away from him, sobbing bitterly. and scrambled to her knees. Ronald jerked her back. "Just a minute. You've got to promise to keep this a secret." Twisting and pushing, Carol tried to break away. She opened her mouth to scream. Ronald bore her to the ground, clasped her mouth. She bit his hand and, gasping, finally managed to emit a wild yell. Ronald seized her throat. "Be quiet! Tilda," he hissed. "Be quiet! Be quiet!" Carol fought and thrashed and kicked, and Ronald squeezed her neck till she became quiet, and when he loosened his grip she lay limp. "Carol," said Ronald, peering down into her face. "Carol." A weird cold sensation came over Ronald. He spoke in an urgent voice. "Carol. Are you just fooling?" "I was just fooling, too. Let's be friends. And hopefully, if you won't tell anyone, I won't." Carol said nothing. Her eyes, half open, reflected glints of grey runilite. Her tongue lolled from her mouth. "She's dead," muttered Ronald. "Oh my, oh my. She's dead." He jumped to his feet and stood staring Dove.7 jail through the shadows. "I mustn't Tilda T lose my head," said Ronald. "I've a got to think." He stood listening through the rye-light. Silence, except for the far hum of town traffic. Here, under the old weeping willow, all noises were hushed. Ronald told himself, "I am different. I have always known I am different. I am superior to the ordinary person, stronger of purpose and more intelligent. Now I must prove this. Very well. I accept the challenge of fate." He drew a deep breath and exhaled. His nerves must bear steel, his will strong as that of some unearthly super creature. So then, first things first. The body must be concealed. He looked around the dim old garden and walked cautiously to a shed, where he found an ancient spade. Just the thing. He selected a spot to the side of the shed and began to dig, first removing his safari jacket so as not to soil it. Hark! A car coming down Honeysuckle Lane, a squeal of brakes. The car halted. Ronald ran to the fence and peered out into the lane. The car was a tan and white station wagon, which Ronald half recognized. The headlights burned through the twilight to illuminate an object in the middle of the road, Carol's bicycle. Ronald's heart jumped up to fill his throat. The driver alighted from the car and moved into the glare of the headlights, a big raw-boned man with the face of an Apache chieftain. Ronald knew him for Donald Matthews, Carol's father. Could he be out searching for Carol? More likely he was just coming home from work. For a moment he stood looking down at the bicycle, clearly vexed by what he assumed to be Carol's carelessness. Then he picked up the bicycle, loaded it into the back of the station wagon, and drove off. There was no time to waste. Ronald thrust the body into the hole and spaded dirt upon the pale glimmer. One moment. Carol's torn underpants. Into the hole and buried with the rest. Ronald stamped the loam down firm and solid, then scattered leaves and twigs and rotten palm fronds on top. He replaced the spade in the shed after wiping it clean of fingerprints, then took one of the palm fronds and worked it over the ground wherever he had walked, hoping thereby to obliterate his footprints. Now he had better leave. He jumped the fence into Honeysuckle Lane and ran // long, fleet strides up to Orchard Street. Here he paused to catch his breath and take stock of the situation. The street was clear of traffic. Ronald continued at a more sedate pace, his mind full of veering thoughts. Certain notions he rejected as unworthy of consideration. The situation was at an end. A deplorable affair, an accident, really. He had carried it off very well. No doubt he should have moved the bicycle before Mr. Matthews found it, but a person couldn't think of everything. From now on, so far as he was concerned, the episode was finished, done with, null and void, non-existent. He would put it clear out of his mind, As if it had never happened. He climbed the steps to the front porch and paused once more. His mother was wonderfully keen. He must act normal at all costs. Light, easy, suave, nerveless, in short, his usual self. He entered the house. His mother sat in the living room watching a television travelogue. "Hello, Mother," said Ronald. "Hello, dear. Where have you been?" "Oh, here and there. At Laurel Hansen's house mostly. I should have taken my swimsuit, everybody else was in the pool." "Laurel Hansen? Isn't she the little blonde girl?" Ronald twitched his lips. He didn't like the sound of the words "the little blonde girl." Carol really wasn't all that little, in fact, but this was a line of thought he absolutely intended not to pursue. "Now or ever. You look a little flushed, dear," said Mrs. Wilby. "And what's that in your hair?" Ronald brushed at the object. "It's just a leaf. He lord. I guess I got a bit sunburnt out by the pool. It's too bad you didn't think to take your bathing suit, but there'll be other times. Where's your new jacket? You'd better hang it neatly on a hanger so it will keep its shape." "What's the trouble?" Ronald stood stiff and still. Chapter 3. "The jacket, it's at the Hansens. I got warm and took it off. I'll run back now and get it." "Don't bother, dear, it's dark. I'm sure it will be safe until tomorrow. I'd just as soon run down and get it now. There's something I want to tell Laurel." Mrs. Wilby darted an appraising glance at Ronald. It wasn't like him to be so energetic. But he was probably worried about his lovely new jacket. She returned to the affairs of the New Guinea headhunters. Ronald ran back down Orchard Street, the pulse thumping in his throat. He turned into Honeysuckle Lane and stopped short at the sight of headlights and a group of men at the back of the Hastings estate. Fascinated, Ronald stole 100 feet closer. 2 of the cars were police cars. Bright lights flickered around the grounds of the Hastings estate. Mr. Matthews had acted swiftly indeed. Ronald turned and stumbled home. He opened the door, faltered into the living room, and slumped upon the couch. Mrs. Wilby looked at him in consternation. "Why, what's the trouble? Can't you find your jacket?" Ronald found that he could not speak. Words stuck in his throat. He lifted his arms and beat the side of his head in frustration. Mrs. Wilby flicked off the television. "What in the world is wrong?" "Ronald, don't act that way. It can't be all that bad." "It's worse than bad," croaked Ronald. "It's the baddest thing that could be. I don't know how to tell you." Mrs. Wilby said in a metallic voice, "Perhaps you'd better start at the beginning." "I was coming home from the Hansens," said Ronald. "In the lane I met a girl, Carol Matthews. She asked me to come with her into the old Hastings place to do something for her, to help her find her dog. I went in and, well, she acted, well, fresh. Sexy, I guess you'd say. Anyway, she wanted me to do it with her, and, well, I did. Then she said she'd tell unless I gave her some money, and I said I wouldn't. She began to yell, and I tried to stop her, and, well, we had a big fight, and by accident. Well, she was dead." There was a long silence. "Ronald," breathed Mrs. Wilby. "Oh, Ronald, how awful, how awful." Ronald proceeded more rapidly. "I was afraid and scared. Horrified. It was all an accident, really, Mother. I did mean to do it. It happened so fast, I couldn't help it." "I understand that, Ronald. But what did you hen?" "Well, I found a shovel and buried her. And then I came home. But I left my jacket. And when I went back just now, the police were there. Mr. Matthews found her bicycle in the lane, and I guess he figured that's where she was." Elaine Wilby sat back in the chair, the structure of her life tumbling into ruins about her. And Ronald's life as well. There would be no mercy for Ronald. They'd take him and lock him up among criminals and degenerates. Ronald said in a hollow voice, I don't know what to do. I don't want to go to jail, and leave home, and leave you. What would they do to me? I've got to think, said Mrs. Wilby. After a moment Ronald said, nobody saw me. I covered all my tracks. There weren't any. His voice drifted away. He had caught the handlebars of Carol's bicycle. He might have left his fingerprints on the metal. Mrs. Wilby wearily shook her head. They've got the jacket. The police will trace it to Gorman's by the label, and the girl will remember that I bought it. It was the last one in stock. Oh, Ronald, how could you do such a thing? I don't know, Mother, I really don't. I just lost my head. If she hadn't said she'd tell and wanted money and started to yell. That makes no difference with the police. It'll be in all the papers. We're simply ruined. And the wonderful career we'd planned for you. Ronald asked uncertainly, do you think I should go to police and tell how it happened? Mrs. Wilby closed her eyes. This was a nightmare. How could such a thing happen to her? The circumstances were unreal. Unreasonable. Unjust. She didn't deserve them, nor did poor, foolish, scared Ronald, who, after all, wasn't much more than a little boy, her own little boy, who trusted her to help him and protect him. But how? I really don't quite know what to do, she said in a passionless voice. I don't have the money to send you away. Your Aunt Margaret, but she wouldn't involve herself in such a mess. Your father. Mrs. Wilby became silent. The idea was too futile to verbalize. It was really an accident, Mother. I wish I'd never seen her. Yes, dear, I understand this very well. You won't go to jail. We've got a day or two until they trace the jacket. But what can we do? I don't really know. Oh, how I wish this hadn't happened, moaned Ronald. If I could only. Ronald, be quiet. I've got to think. 5 minutes passed, with Ronald sniffling and fidgeting and making gurgling sounds in his throat to indicate his remorse and despair. Mrs. Wilby sat like a stone. At last she stirred. Ronald looked at her hopefully. She gave her head a somber shake. It's just a terrible mess. I don't know what to do. Couldn't we both go away somewhere? Maybe to the mountains, or someplace where no one would look for us. Mrs. Wilby sniffed. That's quite impractical, Ronald. Didn't he care to live the life of a fugitive? Even more to the point, I don't have any ready money in the house. I could go to work and support both of us, said Ronald hollowly. Mrs. Wilby uttered a bark of sad laughter. Quite honestly, I don't know what to do. Nothing seems feasible. I suppose I could send you away somewhere. Oh, Mother. I don't want to go off alone. Mrs. Wilby heaved a sigh. I know, dear. I don't want you to leave. The least objectionable scheme is to hide you somewhere until I could get some money together. Then we'd move to the East Coast or perhaps Florida and start life all over again. That sounds as good as anything, said Ronald, blinking back tears for the old easy happy life, forever lost and gone. I don't mind anything, so long as they don't take me away from you. That won't happen, dear. I'm just wondering where we could put you. There's the shed out in back. I could stay there. Mrs. Wilby shook her head. It's the first place the police would look. There's the attic. Remember the den I built up there when I was little? They'll search the attic very carefully, and any other obvious place. And the attic is a very long way to bring up your meals and then carry down the chamber pot, which would be the only possible method of sanitation. We'd want some place where you could live in decency and cleanliness, which means a bathroom. There's our own //td.stairs bathroom, of course. The downstairs bathroom? That doesn't seem too practical. To the contrary, said Mrs. Wilby. It's quite practical indeed. She rose to her feet. But we've got to work very hard. The front door to the Wilby house opened into a hall. To the left lay the living room, to the right the dining room, directly ahead, wide stairs rose to a landing, then reversed up to the second floor. Under these stairs was the bathroom, a combination cloakroom and lavatory with a toilet at the far end under the landing. Only 3 months before Mrs. Wilby and Ronald had repaper-red both the front hall and the bathroom, to make them brighter and less old-fashioned. Now they took the door off the hinges, pried loose the moulding and the door jammed to the studs, the header, and across the floor they nailed cleats, hammering as quietly as they could. Into the aperture they fitted a piece of plasterboard left over from the refinishing of Ronald's room. Before they nailed the plasterboard in place they brought a cot into the bathroom, several blankets, and an electric heater. The far wall of the bathroom adjoined the kitchen pantry. They cut away the lath and plaster of the bathroom wall and low under the bottom shelf in the pantry sawed the plywood to make a secret little door, which Ronald used once or twice to demonstrate that he could get in and out. Then they nailed the plasterboard in place to fill the doorway, and carefully pasted wallpaper over the plasterboard. The baseboard across the bottom of the doorway posed a problem, which they solved by prying a suitable length from an upstairs bedroom and fitting it into place. The downstairs bathroom had now disappeared. The time was 4 o'clock in the morning. Ronald from now on must not be seen. Taking a chance that Mrs. Schumacher, their rather inquisitive neighbor, was asleep at this hour, Mrs. Wilby carried the old door and the old moldings to the rubbish area behind the garage, where they made an inconspicuous addition to the material already there. Ronald meantime brought into the lair his new birthday books, his radio with its earplug attachment, pajamas, bathrobe, slippers, a few other odds and ends. Mrs. Wilby carefully cleaned the front hall and as a last refinement hung a picture across the old doorway. The illusion, in her opinion, was perfect. The lair was undetectable. //1FL began to show grey in the east. You'd better go in, said Mrs. Wilby, and remember, you must learn to be quiet. And never flush the toilet unless you're sure it's safe to do so. One more thing, said Ronald rather importantly, I want my Atlanta notebooks. I might as well have something to work on. And I'm kind of hungry. Get your notebooks, and then go in. It's getting light outside. Ronald brought the notebooks down from his room. I guess that's about all I really need. His mother hardly seemed to hear him. From now on we just can't take any chances. 2 knocks will be the danger signal. That means no noise. Not a sound. When the coast is clear, I'll knock 4 times. Now go on in so you'll be safe. I'll fix your breakfast and pass it in to you. Ronald looked sadly around the kitchen and into the dining room where he and his mother had enjoyed so many pleasant meals. Mrs. Wilby's emotions, which she had carefully held under control, almost got the better of her. His saying goodbye to all this, she thought, and for a fact it is goodbye, because things can never be the same again, for either of us. Ronald spoke in a hushed voice. How long do you think it // be? I just don't know //7, but we've got to be realistic, and I would guess several months at least. Ronald looked glumly over his shoulder toward the secret door. Several months. At least. Perhaps as long as 6 months. I know it's difficult, for both of us, but it can't be helped. I don't mind, Mother, really I don't. I just hope it won't be too long. I hope so, too. As soon as we have enough money, and it's safe to do so, we'll leave. Meanwhile we'll have to be patient and very, very careful. The police will be on the lookout, and we can't do anything rash. That reminds me of something I'd better do. You go on into your den." Ronald went into the pantry, slid open the secret door, crawled into his lair, and pushed the door shut behind him. Mrs. Wilby examined the pantry to make sure that the door was both inconspicuous and secure. She bent over. "Ronald, can you hear me?" "Yes." Ronald's voice was somewhat muffled. "From now on, you're hiding. Don't call or knock or make any sound unless I give you the all-clear signal. What about some breakfast?" "In just a few minutes." Mrs. Wilby went up to Ronald's room and went to the box where he kept his savings. $22. She took the money and left the box on his study table. She opened several of his drawers and rummaged up the contents, and left one of the drawers half open. She lay down on her bed, in order to disarrange the spread and dent the pillows. The bed felt so soothing and she was so bone-weary she just wanted to lie there and rest, but she forced herself to her feet. There seemed to be nothing else to do at the moment. One great relief, today was Sunday and she need not worry about work. Returning downstairs, she fixed Ronald a good breakfast of oatmeal, bacon, eggs, toast and chocolate milk, and set it on a tray. She rapped 4 times on the secret door, pulled it aside, and slid Ronald's breakfast through into the lair as she washed dishes, made coffee for herself, and sat down at the dining room table to wait. Chapter 4. A few minutes after 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. L/1 RS Wilby was still sitting at the table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in front of her. She rose to her feet. "Now it starts." I fever. She needed to keep her wit about her. It was now. Through the dining room window she glimpsed a man in Eton whipcord jacket sauntering past and into the backyard, with slow, almost ponderous, steps. Mrs. Wilby went into the front hall where she gave 2 soft but definite raps on the wall. She listened. No sound from within. She opened the front door. 2 men stood on the porch, a stocky pink-faced man in a rumpled grey-brown suit, the other a taller younger man, hazel-eyed and quite handsome, in the uniform of a deputy sheriff. "Mrs. Wilby?" asked the older man, and Mrs. Wilby thought she had never seen eyes so grey and hard. "Yes." "What do you want?" "We're from the sheriff's office." "I'm Sergeant Lynch." He displayed credentials. "May we come in?" Mrs. Wilby silently drew back, and the 2 men entered. They walked very lightly for such strong, heavy men. She thought. She took them into the living room and pulled back the drapes, letting light into the room. "What do you want?" "Ice it." The words went heavy in her mouth. Both men were watching her with calm expressions. They seemed detached rather than unsympathetic. Lynch said, "We're here on an unpleasant errand, Mrs. Wilby." "Ronald Wilby is your son?" Mrs. Wilby nodded. She had rehearsed this scene several times. "Why do you ask?" "Will you please call him?" Mrs. Wilby walked to the green plush armchair and sat down. "Why are you asking these questions?" And she forced herself to ask, "What has Ronald done?" "Late yesterday a young girl was assaulted and killed. The evidence suggests that Ronald may know something about the business. This must come as shocking news to you, but the situation is as I've explained it, and now I have to ask you to call Ronald. It would also be wise for you to have a lawyer present while we're questioning him." "Ronald isn't here," said Mrs. Wilby. "He left the house last night and hasn't come home." For 10 seconds the 2 policemen stared at her, and Mrs. Wilby wondered if guilty knowledge might be printed in her face. The deputy spoke for the first time. "What time did he come home yesterday afternoon?" "I don't remember exactly. It must have been about 6 or perhaps a bit later." "Did he seem disturbed?" "Did he mention or even hint that he might have done something wrong?" "Not in so many words." "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Wilby spoke in a weary voice. "He didn't seem himself." I asked if anything were wrong and he said no. He'd been over to a friend's house, and I thought something might have happened that he didn't want to talk about, so I didn't press him. What friend had he visited? Mrs. Wilby sat dull and passive. The deputy repeated the question. He went to Laurel Hansen's house, on Drury Way. And he was disturbed when he came home. What did he say? Mrs. Wilby put her hand to her forehead. After a moment she said, I can't believe Ronald would do such a thing. It's not like him. He's always been gentle. I certainly sympathize with you, Mrs. Wilby, said Lynch. How can you be sure Ronald did this? We have several items of evidence, said Lynch. His flight certainly isn't the act of an innocent person. Mrs. Wilby sat silent. Do you have any idea where he might have gone? No idea whatever? Lynch glanced at the deputy, who rose to his feet. Lynch asked, Do you mind if we have a look around? He just might be hiding, in the attic, or in a closet, or some such place. Mrs. Wilby gave a weary shrug. Look as much as you like. The two men went upstairs. Mrs. Wilby leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes, listening to the footsteps as the men examined Ronald's room, his closet, the other 3 bedrooms, the bathroom and the attic. Returning downstairs, they passed through the dining room into the kitchen and out upon the back porch, where Lynch spoke to the man stationed in the backyard. A moment later Mrs. Wilby heard someone open the lattice door giving into the crawl space under the house. Lynch and the deputy returned to the living room. Do I feel up to answering a few questions, Mrs. Wilby? I won't trouble you any more than necessary, I promise you. Tilda, ask your questions, said Mrs. Wilby in a cold voice. Nothing would arouse their suspicion so much as over friendliness. You're divorced from Ronald's father? Yes. Is Ronald friendly with his father? He doesn't feel much one way or the other. He'd hardly likely to seek him out, if that's what you're after. Where would Ronald be likely to go? Have you any ideas? No. None at all. Don't forget, Mrs. Wilby, the deputy inserted, it's to everyone's advantage to get this matter cleared up as soon as possible. Except Ronald's. Mrs. Wilby spoke bitterly. If Ronald committed this act, and it appears that he did, then he's got to be restrained before he does it again. I'm sure you'll agree to this. Of course. But he's my son, and I'm not convinced they did what you say he did. Who was the girl? Carol Matthews. She lived on May Street. About 6 o'clock she started home from a friend's house on her bicycle, apparently by way of Honeysuckle Lane, behind the Hastings place. Ronald would also have come by Honeysuckle Lane on his way home from Drury Way. That doesn't prove anything, declared Mrs. Wilby. It might have been anyone. Perhaps Ronald saw what was going on, perhaps the real criminal threatened him, or frightened him in some way. We found Ronald's jacket where the girl was buried. There was blood on the hem of the jacket. He left footprints on the grave and elsewhere, and they seem to match the basketball shoes we found in Ronald's room. We'll have to take them with us, of course. They're evidence. I don't have any doubt but what the soil in the treads will match the soil at the scene of the crime. And also he brought forth a sheet of paper. This was in Ronald's room. Mrs. Wilby took the paper. She knew what was there. She had dictated it herself, and Ronald had written, Dear Mother, I've done something awful, and now I've got to leave and go somewhere far away. Please don't try to find me. I want to start a new life. If and when I can, I'll write you. I'm so very sorry to cause you unhappiness. All my love, your son Ronald. Mrs. Wilby closed her eyes, half convinced that Ronald had indeed written the note and had gone far away where she would never see him again. Oh, to be allowed to turn 24 hours in time. The 2 policemen remained politely silent until Mrs. Wilby opened her eyes. Lynch asked, Has Ronald ever spoken of a place he particularly wanted to visit? "No," spoke Mrs. Wilby in a plangent, fateful voice. "Ronald is gone. If he did what you say he did." She hesitated. The deed was unreal. The more they talked, the more abstract it became. "I suppose the news will be in the papers, and all Ronald's friends will know. I don't see how it can be avoided. You have my sympathy, Mrs. Wilby. Parents always suffer most, both sets of parents." Mrs. Wilby had not yet considered the plight of the Matthews family. "I don't believe I know them." For some reason she could not bring herself to pronounce the name. "Donald Matthews operates the Happy Valley Saloon on South Main Street. It's a very respectable place, incidentally. His son Dwayne used to be your paper boy." Mrs. Wilby nodded without interest. Lynch asked, "How much money would Ronald have with him?" "I don't really know. Perhaps $20 or $30. The policemen rose to their feet. "If Ronald communicates with you, we'll expect you to let us know at once." Mrs. Wilby remained silent. She prided herself on her truthfulness and now found deceit very difficult indeed. The police officers departed. A few minutes later Mrs. Wilby saw them next door, on Mrs. Schumacher's front porch, and presently they were admitted into the house. They'd get an earful there for sure. Mrs. Wilby thought of her job and the people with whom she worked. She thrust out her jaw. No help for it. If there were whispers and stares, she'd simply have to bear up and take no notice. As soon as possible, she and Ronald would quietly slip off to some far place and never think of Oakmead again. Until that day, well, at the very least she could dismiss her bleak fear of loneliness. Mrs. Wilby felt upset to her stomach, almost queasy with tension and fatigue. She went around the house, wandering from room to room, looking out the windows. The police had departed. Almost certainly they'd maintain a watch on the house, and they'd probably keep her under surveillance as well. She'd have to be crafty and cunning, especially while shopping, since she'd still her veto buy for two. And Mrs. Schumacher was always a threat. No doubt the police had asked her to keep her eyes peeled, as if Mrs. Schumacher needed any encouragement. Mrs. Wilby at last went into the pantry and knelt down by the secret door. She rapped 4 times and slid the door a few inches ajar. "Ronald." "Yes, Mother." "The police have been here. I heard them." Ronald's voice was peevish. "They don't sound too nice. They're only policemen doing their job. To them you read just like anyone else. We'll have to be very careful indeed." "I realize that, Mother. I'm really sorry I'm making all this trouble. I just couldn't help it. It happened so quickly." "I know all about that. Push out your breakfast tray. I'd like my lunch. I'm really hungry. Is there any of that cake left? I don't know what we'll do when I'm at work. But remember, under no circumstances come out. Mrs. Schumacher will be watching with her nose to the window, and the police will also be watching. If they see you, all our plans will go for nothing. I'll be careful. Can I flush the toilet now?" "Just a minute. I'll go upstairs. When you hear the upstairs toilet, you flush yours. How is the air in there?" "It's stuffy." "Doesn't the fan over the toilet work?" "It doesn't do much good. There's no place for air to come in. We'll have to figure something out. For now you'll just have to be uncomfortable. I'll go up and flush the toilet, then I'll fix your lunch." Chapter 5. A week passed, and 2 weeks. Mrs. Wilby went about her ordinary routines as placidly as she was able. At Central Valley Hardware she was admired for her dignity and fortitude, credit which she did not altogether deserve, for she had taken herself so deeply into her new existence that she was hardly aware of other people or their judgments. 2 persons only were real, Ronald and herself. She worked toward a single goal, enough money to move away from California, perhaps to Canada, though how this could be achieved she was not quite sure. At home Mrs. Wilby spent considerable time contriving economies. Ronald's requirements were now minimal except for food and whatever he needed to keep himself entertained. He wanted a small television with a set of earphones, which Mrs. Wilby refused to provide, citing the expense of such an instrument. Privately she felt that the television would provide far too much erotic stimulation for a person in his circumstances, and for which Ronald demonstrably had no need. Mrs. Wilby had never squandered money on food, and now she spent less. Ronald made few complaints so long as he was served an ample dessert. Mrs. Wilby began to fear that Ronald might become seriously overweight, what with his inactivity and the rather starchy diet. She expressed her misgivings and recommended that Ronald not only eat less but undertake a regular regimen of exercise. Ronald rejected the suggestion out of hand. "It's too hard to exercise in here. There's not all that much room." "Nonsense, Ronald. You can do that running in place exercise, and all kinds of calisthenics. Certainly you don't want to become fat." "Exercise just makes me hungry," Ronald grumbled. "I'd eat more." "In that case, I'll have to cut down on your portions, and forget about desserts. When we go east, we want you to be trim and healthy." Ronald muttered something inaudible, but nonetheless began to exercise. Through some inexplicable quirk he became interested in the process, and Mrs. Wilby began to hear the regular thump of his feet as he ran in place. Indeed, she felt obliged to caution him. "When I'm not home, never run or jog, because the sound is quite noticeable, and there's also a vibration. The mailman might notice, or the man who reads the meter. Just do push-ups and isometric exercises, anything that's absolutely quiet. When we have a new home, I'd like a room I could make into a gymnasium," said Ronald. "I might even take up weightlifting." Mrs. Wilby had chanced upon a weightlifting contest while turning the television dials, and had watched in fascinated disgust. "I don't know about that. Those people always look so grotesque. You just develop a good healthy body and never mind the weightlifting." To Mrs. Wilby's relief, Ronald never expressed a desire to leave his lair, not even late at night /7 hen. It might have been safe. Mrs. Wilby was afraid that if he left the lair even once, a precedent would be set, and Ronald would want to come forth at ever more frequent intervals, until by some freak of chance he would be noticed and his presence reported to the police. Better, far better, to play the game safely. They had worked so hard and said so much. Any relaxation would be sheer folly. The issue never arose. Ronald felt comfortable and secure. The room was now adequately ventilated. He had broken a hole through the lath and plaster of the wall beside the toilet, which allowed a draught of air to enter from the attic, by way of the space between the studs. His meals were to his liking, if a trifle scant at times, but on the other hand he was no longer required to dry dishes. In fact, he had no responsibilities whatever, except to be brutally silent and to keep his weight down. All, of course, was not a bed of roses. His mother's attitude did not altogether suit him. At times her tone of voice was just a bit peremptory and she tended to reiterate the most elementary instructions, as if she still considered him a child. That was just about the situation, thought Ronald wisely. His mother was competent in all things, but she had never reconciled herself to his growing up. The situation nonetheless had its compensations. Nothing too irksome was expected of him, and if he coaxed long enough, he could usually get about what he wanted in the way of small treats. Matters could be a great deal worse, and if his mother wanted to baby him a bit, why spoil her pleasure? Ronald nodded sagely. This was generous and unselfish conduct on his part. He hoped his mother appreciated it. She enjoyed taking care of him, and until this unfortunate affair blew over she gave ample opportunity to do so. Meanwhile, His little den was cozy and secure. Ronald became obsessed with exercise. His mother drove into Stockton and bought some cheap exercising aids and a bodybuilding manual, with which Ronald was very pleased. At his request, she also supplied him a set of watercolors, a pad of good paper, ballpoint and felt tippet with various inks, as well as notebooks, a compass, a ruler, and a dozen pencils. Ronald explained that he had long wanted to write and illustrate a history of the magic land Atlanta and now seemed as good a time as any. Mrs. Wilby gave only lukewarm encouragement to the project. She would have preferred that Ronald study biology and mathematics and anatomy, to prepare himself for the medical career to be undertaken after they had re-established themselves. Ronald agreed that the notion was sound, but when his mother brought him books on these subjects he showed little interest in them. One Saturday, about 6 weeks after his first visit, Sergeant Lynch again dropped in on Mrs. Wilby. Hearing a car stop in front of the house, she looked out the window, then ran into the hall to rap sharply twice on the wall. Lynch rang the bell. Mrs. Wilby opened the door and looked impassively forth. "May I come in?" Lynch asked. "It's more comfortable than standing on the porch." Mrs. Wilby silently took him into the living room. Lynch seated himself on the sofa. Mrs. Wilby asked, "Have you been able to find Ronald?" Lynch gave his head a slow, sad shake. "Not a trace. Not even a whisper. It's as if he vanished into thin air, to coin a phrase. Have you heard from him, by any chance?" Mrs. Wilby snorted almost derisively. "Wherever he is, I hope he lives a straight, clean life, to make up for what happened here." "I hope so, too, Mrs. Wilby. That would be practical rehabilitation, if it happened like that. Too often it doesn't, but we won't go into that." Lynch leaned back and crossed his legs, apparently comfortable and in no hurry to leave. Mrs. Wilby sat tense and anxious, one ear straining for any sound that Ronald carelessly might make. What if he flushed the toilet now, for instance? But silence prevailed. Lynch rose to his feet. "This is a real big house for just you to be rattling around in. Don't I get a little lonely?" Mrs. Wilby managed a smile. "Believe it or not, after you work all day, I enjoy the quiet. I can do exactly what I want and when I want, which is worth a little loneliness." "You might be right there." "Well, I guess we haven't anything to tell each other, and I might as well be going. Don't forget to call me if you hear from Ronald." Mrs. Wilby could not restrain a question. "Have you seen his father?" Lynch nodded. "He was very disturbed, as you might imagine. But he knows nothing of Ronald's whereabouts, or so he claims." Lynch grinned. "Naturally, we take the assertions of a parent with a grain of salt." "I'm sure you know your business," said Mrs. Wilby somewhat tartly. "I'm not Sergeant Lynch for nothing. And if I don't produce results, I might be just plain Deputy Lynch again, and in very short order. That's the way it goes. Goodbye, Mrs. Wilby." "Goodbye." Mrs. Wilby watched through the window as Lynch got into his car and drove away. She walked around the house as before, looking out all the windows. The coast seemed to be clear. How she hated this conniving and working against the law. She who had never so much as incurred a traffic citation in her entire life. What a sorry mess. But if it meant having Ronald here with her instead of in some horrid jail full of sexual degenerates, any sacrifice was worthwhile. What was the phrase Sergeant Lynch had used? Practical rehabilitation. Exactly what she was achieving. Ronald essentially was a dreamy, impractical boy who needed his mother to look after him and probably would always do so. The idea gave Mrs. Wilby a flush of pleasure. It was nice to feel necessary in a world so cold and impersonal. She went into the pantry and tapped 4 times on the door, which Ronald raised up. They had long since fitted hinges and a latch on the panel, and the secret door now functioned in a most convenient manner. "The police were just here," said Mrs. Wilby. "I think it was just a routine call, but once again it shows how careful we must be." "We're just too clever for them," declared Ronald. "You're really a wonderful actress." "I'm nothing of the sort," snapped Mrs. Wilby. This gloating jocularity was definitely not the tone she wanted Ronald to take. She wondered if he really appreciated the seriousness of the situation. He certainly evinced none of restlessness and melancholy which would have made both their lives harder but which would have reassured her. To the contrary, he seemed quite happy eating, reading, sleeping, exercising and working on his imaginary history. She made up her mind to crack down on Ronald. She would insist that he study science and mathematics. But not just now, she was in no mood for argument. In the tension of Sergeant Lynch's visit she had forgotten to take her digestive tablet, and now she did so her stomach still felt twisted and queasy. The last thing she wanted was an ulcer. She fixed dinner for herself and Ronald, and afterwards calculated how long it would be before they could consider leaving. Originally she had reckoned in terms of a few months, 6 months at the most, but money accumulated so slowly. They'd want at least $2,000, she'd hate to leave with less. A year? By that time the furore and scandal would be forgotten. They could make an unobtrusive move and no one would be so a target date of a year. A very long time, but the longer they remained in Oakmead, the better their chance for a successful new start in life. It was hard on Ronald, of course. Poor dear Ronald. He had been such a cunning little chapter. Who would have foreseen the terrible tragedy which might have blighted his life had she not been able to help him? A year would go by very swiftly, she'd have the necessary $2,000, or perhaps even $3,000, if she could cut down even more own expenses. For instance, life insurance premiums. They'd be taking new identities. What good was the old insurance? She'd cash it in at once. Ronald's health insurance was now a useless expenditure. She'd cancel that, and her own as well, and save another precious $35 a month. Ronald's requirements for clothes, recreation, and miscellaneous needs were now almost nil. Her own clothes were cheap and serviceable, and if she needed anything new, perhaps she'd try to sew for herself. This month she'd stop the newspaper and renew no magazine subscriptions, and somewhere'd heard that soybean meal made a cheap and nutritious meat extender. Well worth a trial, since meat was so high. The telephone? Mrs. Wilby deliberated, and decided against terminating service. Sometimes she needed to call the office. But she could easily change to a party line, limited use basis. It all added up. Perhaps someday, when Ronald was rich and successful, they'd take a trip to Europe. She'd always wanted to visit Venice and Paris and the stately homes of England, and then perhaps they would be able to laugh at the dark times through which they were now passing. Or would either care to bring the subject up? Probably not.